Guess what? I just started a new denomination in my basement. In this denomination, it's heretical to get a low taper fade. Hey guys, welcome back to KingdomCraft, where I build this big church in Minecraft while talking about Christianity, and today we're going to talk about how Protestantism is not as divided as a lot of people think. People keep saying, like, oh, Protestantism has 40 million denominations, or maybe it's 50 million now. The number keeps going up. There was this one statistic from Gordon Conwell Seminary that said Protestants have 40,000 denominations, and ever since then people keep quoting that as if it's reliable. But once you actually look into the methodology for how they counted the denominations, you'll realize it kind of is meaningless. Because that same statistic from Gordon Conwell said there were like a few hundred Catholic denominations and a few hundred Orthodox denominations, because they counted the same denomination in different countries as different denominations, and they counted every non-denominational church as its own denomination. So the number's not 40,000. It still can seem pretty high. It still can seem like there are many different types of Protestants, but I am not speaking on behalf of everything that is called Protestantism. I am a mainline Protestant. And I don't think mainline Protestantism is actually that divided, and I'll explain why. So while I'm recording, I'm going to go mining in the Baptist mining land so I can take their resources. I still need to get more cobblestone because I'm mostly building out of cobblestone, and this is some newly settled land. It's part of the server that was off limits before, but we've expanded it, and now the server is even more laggy as a result, but at least we can settle some new land. I've never actually been here, really. Alright, this is a cool boat. So yeah, I am a mainline Protestant. I'm not an evangelical Protestant. So I will grant that evangelical Protestantism is very divided. There are lots of different evangelical groups. Most of evangelicalism in America is non-denominational, and even the evangelicals that are part of denominations are part of all sorts of small things. Like, amongst conservative evangelical Presbyterians, there's like 20 different small denominations. The same is true of a lot of the evangelical Baptists. There's also a bunch of Pentecostal denominations. There's like, I think, Calvary Chapel or something. There's a lot of things. So evangelicalism is a mess, and I am perfectly comfortable throwing evangelicals under the bus. A lot of the Catholic and Orthodox criticisms of Protestantism that do not apply to mainline Protestants do indeed apply to evangelicals. So if you are evangelical, I'm sorry, this video isn't really defending you, but I'm a mainline Protestant. Mainline Protestantism in America is like the PCUSA, the United Methodist Church, the Episcopal Church, the Evangelical Lutheran Church, the American Baptists, the Reformed Church in America, and the United Church of Christ. And all of them are in some degree of communion with each other. So there are seven distinct traditions, but they're all in communion. Sort of like Russian Orthodoxy and Greek Orthodoxy. Actually, they're not in communion now because of the whole war thing, but generally they were in communion. Like Romanian Orthodox, Bulgarian Orthodox, they're distinct traditions and distinct organizations. They're autocephalous, that's the word in Orthodoxy, but they're still considered the same thing. They're still all under the umbrella of Eastern Orthodox because they're still all in some degree of communion with each other, whether direct or indirect. And the same is true of the 7 mainline Protestant churches in America. And it's not just in America. The 7 mainline Protestant denominations in America are also in communion with their equivalents overseas. So the result is that there are over 300 million mainline Protestants worldwide, all in communion with each other. That is more than the global number of Eastern Orthodoxy. So when I tell people, well, I'm not an evangelical Protestant, I'm a mainline Protestant, they'll act like mainline Protestantism is this niche, obscure thing where I'm like, oh, actually, your criticisms of Protestantism don't apply to me because I'm this, like, rare, special type of Protestantism. But no, mainline Protestantism is not rare, and it's not special. That's why it's called mainline. It is the mainstream Protestantism that's actually descended from the Reformation. Evangelical Protestantism is not directly descended from the Reformation. Some of it is indirectly, like it's descended from things that split off from groups that are descended from the Reformation, or some of it's just not descended at all. Like much of evangelicalism comes from the Anabaptists, not from the magisterial real Reformation. Like, Baptists have a mixed ancestry. Like, traditional mainline American Baptists come from, like, the British nonconformists, so they can be considered Protestant. But your average Baptist church in America, especially like independent Baptist church, can't really trace its heritage back to the Reformation. It's basically just Anabaptist. And the Anabaptists were considered more heterodox by the Reformers than the Catholics. The Reformers considered themselves closer to Roman Catholicism than to the Anabaptists. So Anabaptists and these other evangelical groups, I wouldn't even put under the umbrella of Protestant at all. I understand that generally people do, generally the media divides things into mainline Protestant and evangelical Protestant, and I guess that makes sense. But it's not really a meaningful grouping. If you just define Protestant as anything that calls itself Christian that's not Catholic or Orthodox, then that's a meaningless category. If it's a negative category, if it's defined by the negative attribute of not being Catholic or Orthodox, then anything that someone starts could be considered Protestant. Then, if I start a denomination in my basement centered around Skibbity, Ohio Riz, then that's a Protestant denomination. And then Gordon Conwell is going to say, hey look, now there's 40,001 Protestant denominations. So there needs to be some meaningful definition of Protestant. Some people say, oh, what about the 5 solas? Well, the 5 solas were not really a thing until the 20th century. Like, yeah, we've always believed in what the 5 solas say, but, like, systemizing them like that and saying, these are the 5 solas, and using them as a summary of Protestant doctrine wasn't really a thing until the 20th century. Like, John Calvin didn't know about any 5 solas. And in Europe, they still have 4 solas, I've heard from European Protestants. So the only meaningful definition of Protestant, like I said, is something that has to do with the Protestant Reformation. So the mainline Protestants are the Protestants that have direct descent from the Protestant Reformation. There are over 300 million mainline Protestants. They're all in communion with each other. So that's why I don't think Protestantism is really that divided. Like, yes, there's a lot of evangelical offshoot groups, lots of them, and evangelicals legitimately are very divided, but I don't really care. I don't really care about evangelicalism. I don't see why I have to care about them, because I'm not that, and I'm not telling people to be that. I don't advocate for people being that. So yes, the Catholic criticisms of Protestantism do apply to evangelicalism, but mainline Protestantism is really not that divided. Now, some people might say, okay, maybe mainline Protestantism has this unity. Maybe they're all sort of under the same umbrella. Maybe they're all in communion. But mainline Protestantism is very liberal. Now, there is a big problem of liberalism within mainline Protestantism today. That is literally the entire reason that my YouTube channel exists, is to fight liberalism in mainline Protestantism. And this is mostly true of America. I think in the United States and in some other Western countries like England, like the Church of England, the majority of mainline Protestant churches are liberal to some degree. Not all of them. There's a great minority of mainline Protestant churches that are not liberal, and in the description of this video, I'm going to link a map of mainline Protestant churches that are not liberal. But it is a tendency. It is a problem. But that doesn't discredit Protestantism for 2 reasons. Number 1, because there have been times when the majority of the church was heretical. There was the Arian crisis in the 4th century, where the majority of bishops were Arian heretics, where the majority of bishops did not believe that Jesus was God. That's a bigger problem than women pastors. I'm sorry. That is a bigger problem than pastors preaching about some liberal political issue. Not believing that Jesus is God means you are not a Christian in any sense whatsoever. I think people are so fired up by the culture war that they think a pastor saying something culturally or politically liberal is worse than a pastor being an Arian heretic. I don't think either of them is good, but one is clearly a bigger deal than another. Like, our doctrine of God, our doctrine of Jesus, is more important than our worldly political doctrines, okay? Even though politics is important, I'm not one of those Christians who's like, actually, I don't think the gospel is political. Yet the reason that you live in a Western country and have the privilege of the freedoms of being in a Western country is because Christians applied their faith to politics. So that's really silly. But even so, our doctrine of Christ is most important. So yes, mainline Protestantism has problems with liberalism in America, but that doesn't discredit Protestantism, because if that discredited the church, then we would have had to split from the church once it fell into Arianism, mostly at least, but that's not what St. Athanasius did. St. Athanasius retook the church. He didn't split off. And he might be like, oh, well, what about Martin Luther? He split off. No, he didn't. He got kicked out. Getting thrown out the window is not the same as walking out the door. Anyway, So that's the first reason. The second reason is that globally, mainline Protestantism is not actually that liberal. It's not majority liberal. The majority of mainline Protestants globally are not liberal, are traditional, are conservative. So in America, mainline Protestantism is liberal. Do you know why? Well, first of all, Western countries just have a liberalism problem. That's just the side effect of being, prosperous. But not all Western countries have liberal mainline Protestant churches. In Australia, for example, the mainline Presbyterian, Lutheran, and Anglican churches are all pretty conservative. I know that Sydney Anglicanism has a problem of being a bit low church, but it doesn't have a problem of being liberal, that's for sure. The Presbyterian Church of Australia used to ordain women, but then they undid it. Same with the State Lutheran Church of Latvia. The Presbyterian Church in Ireland is still conservative. So even in Western countries, there's a lot of conservative mainline Protestant churches. But especially if you expand beyond the West, then mainline Protestant liberalism is basically non-existent. The mainline Presbyterian Church in Brazil is huge, and it's not obviously not as big as the Catholic Church there, because Brazil's a historically Catholic country, but there's still lots of Brazilian Presbyterians. The IPB is a huge denomination, and it is very, very conservative. More conservative than the Catholic Church there, I've heard. I've heard that a lot of Latin American Catholicism is filled with liberation theology, because liberation theology does come from Latin American Catholicism. But the Presbyterian Church in Brazil is very conservative. The National Presbyterian Church in Mexico, the mainline Presbyterian Church in Mexico, is very conservative. So the majority of mainline Protestantism globally is not actually that liberal. There are liberal subsections of global mainline Protestantism, but like in Catholicism today, there's, the German Catholic bishops that are doing like gay marriages and stuff. I know that that doesn't represent global Catholicism, and that's why I don't use that as an argument against Catholicism. Like some people are trying to say, oh bro, the Catholic Church is going liberal. Like look, there's this one priest who did a pride mass, but I know that that does not represent Catholicism globally or generally, so I don't use that as an argument against Catholicism, because I try to be intellectually honest here. I know a lot of Protestant apologists aren't very intellectually honest, and they'll say, oh yeah, because there's like these 3 liberal Catholics like Father James Martin, it means the whole church has gone liberal. No, it hasn't. Even Pope Francis, I don't think is really that liberal, especially with his statements on abortion and gay marriage. Now, I'm really hoping Pope Francis is still alive when I post this video, because I'm praying for Pope Francis, because while I'm recording this, he's like in critical condition due to his sickness, so I'm really hoping praying and hoping that he recovers, because I like Pope Francis. He's probably the most pro-Protestant pope that there's ever been. I like Pope Francis as far as popes go. But anyway, okay, I had to make a shield. So yeah. The Anglican Communion is famous for being liberal in Western countries because the Church of England and the Episcopal Church do have a lot of cases of liberalism, but the Anglican Communion is way bigger than just those 2 provinces of it. Like, yeah, England and America, overall, are falling to liberalism, just the societies. So, as a result, the churches in America and England are also falling to liberalism, but globally, the Anglican Communion is still quite conservative. The, 85% or something of the Anglican Communion rejected the liberalism of Archbishop Justin Welby before he resigned. So, with Presbyterians, with Lutherans, and with Anglicans, the majority worldwide is conservative, and collectively, they make up 300 million global mainline Protestants. So what this shows is that mainline Protestantism, globally, is not really that divided, and it's not really that liberal. Yes, there's some divisions. Obviously, there's divisions between the liberals and conservatives in that denomination, but that's a good division. Like, no, I don't want to be united, at least not theologically, with the liberals. I'm fine being united ecclesiastically with the liberals in the denomination, the theological liberals, as long as I am actively working to have them kicked out. Like, some people try and use it as a mark against me, to say I'm in communion with these heretics. Like, there'll be some video on TikTok, this viral video of a PCUSA pastor saying God loves abortion, and on Twitter people are going to be like, oh, Redeemed Zoomer's in communion with these people, and I'm like, yeah, and I started a non-profit to get them kicked out of the denomination, so, yeah, just because I am in the same denomination as them doesn't mean I approve of them. It's like if your country's getting invaded by, I don't know, orcs. I'm watching The Hobbit later today. So if your country's getting invaded by orcs, so to speak, it wouldn't make sense for someone to make fun of you and say, hey, you live in the same country as orcs, and I'm like, yeah, I'm at war with them. So that's a really stupid thing when people try and discredit conservative mainline Protestants by saying, oh, we're in communion with these liberals. Now, I will say, there are a lot of conservative mainline Protestants, especially in, like, the boomer generation, who are in communion with these liberals and, like, don't do anything about it. In our Reconquista nonprofit, Presbyterians for the Kingdom, which you can donate to in the description, by the way, we have noticed that there are a lot of quiet conservatives in the mainline churches, but they're just cowardly. Like, I make fun of retreatists, cowardly retreatists, and that's kind of why American churches are so liberal, because conservatives keep running away from those churches. Like, if you're wondering why American mainline Protestantism is so liberal, and globally it's not, it's because Americans just have this retreatist, consumerist mindset, where if your needs are not being met right now, then you can just split off and form something else. So I pick on the retreatists a lot, saying it's bad to retreat from the church just because it's getting bad. If you get kicked out like Luther did, that's one thing. But you shouldn't retreat from the church just because there's problems. But there's also people who don't retreat, but are just not willing to speak up. Like in my church, it's not my church anymore because I moved, but I used to be in a sort of like moderately liberal PCUSA church, and the congregation had tons of conservative lay people and elders. But whenever there was some liberal thing going on at church, they would like speak about it in hushed whispers. They'd be like, I don't think that was a good idea, but I'm not going to say anything about it. So generally in America, and just in general, I think conservatives are cowards. And that's why liberals win. Conservatives are cowards, and they're retreatists. Either they don't speak up, or they do speak up, but then they leave the institution. Conservatives can only really have an impact if they stop being such cowards, if they stop being retreatists, and they start to take back their institutions. And that is happening in certain institutions. Like, liberalism really infected most of the churches in the mid-20th century, and in the Roman Catholic Church, the sort of high point of liberalism was probably the 1960s. The boomer generation of Catholics was the liberal generation of Catholics. But all young Catholic priests who are getting ordained to the priesthood are pretty conservative. So I think the fact that Catholics just stuck with their institution through the liberalism is kind of why things are getting better for them. But in American mainline Protestant churches, when they went liberal, people just split from them and started these new evangelical churches. And when they split from the mainlines, they didn't go in one direction, they went in like infinite directions. So now that's why the mainline churches aren't really getting better. But in other countries where people didn't leave the mainline churches, things are getting better. Like the Presbyterian Church of Ireland, like I said, it did flirt with liberalism a bit in like the 1980s, but now things are getting better. Now it's healing itself. The Presbyterian Church of Australia flirted with liberalism a bit, but then the liberals ended up leaving the Presbyterian Church in Australia to form the Uniting Church. So now the Presbyterian Church in Australia is shifting to the right. So if you just stick it out, if you simply don't run away, things will get better and things will start to go in your favor. That's why I'm not leaving the PCUSA just because things are liberal, things are going more liberal. The reason they keep going more liberal is because conservatives keep running away. But I don't want to turn this video into another Reconquista infomercial. I mean, I would love to actually, but that's not what you guys came here for. My point is that, yes, Protestantism does have divisions, and yes, Protestantism does have a liberalism problem, but it's not nearly as bad as people say it is. Like, once again, if you're an evangelical Protestant, there's really no escaping the fact that there's so much division. I don't think evangelical Protestants really care. Like, the whole premise of evangelicalism is that denominations don't matter that much. You could trace the origins of evangelicalism to the Anabaptists, but it's really hard to track, like, the genetics of evangelicalism, because evangelicalism isn't like an institution that has evolved over the centuries the way mainline Protestantism is. Evangelicalism is really a tendency that keeps popping up. It keeps appearing in multiple forms. So in the 1500s, it was the Anabaptists, and in the 1600s, it was the radical nonconformists, who were just splitting from every denomination. And Robert Bailey writes against the radical nonconformists. Robert Bailey is one of the Scottish Presbyterian Westminster divines who wrote the Westminster Confession. And Robert Bailey said that even churches falling into heresy does not justify schism. Robert Bailey says that even if your church is falling into heresy and the lampstand is threatened to be removed and there's blasphemy of the Eucharist, he still says that does not justify splitting from the church and starting a new one. So given that, no Presbyterian who wants to follow Westminster, I think, can justify splitting from the mainline Presbyterian church and starting new ones. That's why I think J. Gresham Machen was a retreatist, and we should not honor his legacy in any way. He started the Orthodox Presbyterian Church. So yeah, that's a controversial take of mine, because I know a lot of you guys might be in like the OPC or those similar Presbyterian schismatic denominations, but they are schismatic. And Ignatius of Antioch very clearly says schism is sin, and he doesn't say schism is sin unless your church gets liberal and then it's fine. He doesn't say that. Generally, the idea was that voluntary schism in the church is sin. There have been schisms, but you shouldn't voluntarily start one, even if your church is getting liberal. Okay. I promise, I'm going to stop talking about Reconquista stuff. So, but the point is that evangelicalism is based on the idea that denominations as institutions and organizations don't matter. That was the belief of the Anabaptists in the 1500s. That was the belief of the radical nonconformists in the 1600s. In the 1700s, the evangelicals were those who favored the First Great Awakening. Gilbert Tennent was one of the New Light Presbyterians during the First Great Awakening, who said that if you think your minister is unsaved, you should leave your church and find a new one. Not just if your minister is preaching heresy, but even if your minister is preaching all the right things and has good moral character, but if you think he just isn't truly born again for whatever reason, you should split from your church and start a new one. That is insanity. And he rightly got kicked out of the Presbyterian Church for that, which is why he started the New Light Presbyterian Church. And 18 years later, the New Lights apologized and came back to the Old Light Church. But still, it was still quite a mess. And the Second Great Awakening was the same, but more extreme. In the Second Great Awakening, you really had evangelicals starting new denominations and rejecting all traditional church hierarchies. And the Second Great Awakening is when evangelicals sort of got their modern name, evangelical. Like during the Reformation, evangelical just meant Protestant, and in Europe it still just means that. So in Europe, if you go to like your local evangelical church, that's just like a Reformed or Lutheran church. But in America, the word evangelical was really defined by non-denominationalism and the Great Awakenings. So yeah, the way to systematize it, if you want, in the 1500s, the evangelicals were the Anabaptists. In the 1600s, the evangelicals were the radical nonconformists. In the 1700s, the evangelicals were the First Great Awakening. In the 1800s, the evangelicals were the Second Great Awakening. In the 1900s, the evangelicals are followers of the non-denominational and charismatic movements. And today, I would say evangelicals are basically the same, non-denominationals, followers of these charismatic movements, and also people who have split off from mainline denominations to form their own denominations. So evangelicalism has always led to endless schism, and although there's technically not 40,000 evangelical denominations, there's quite a lot, and evangelicals are okay with that. Because evangelicals don't really care about denominations. Even people who are evangelicals in some sort of Presbyterian offshoot, or even in a mainline church, the evangelical mindset is that if your denomination stopped existing, you'd be fine as long as your congregation was okay. And this is a mindset that I am trying to fight. Like, that's why I stepped back from Protestant apologetics for a while. Because most of the criticisms of Protestantism, which is really criticisms of evangelicalism, I agree with. So I don't think Protestantism is defensible if you're defining Protestantism as mainly evangelicalism. And a lot of evangelicals, even ones that might be in some sort of Presbyterian or Lutheran or Anglican church, have a fundamentally evangelical view of the church, where they choose churches based on how the individual congregation is. I've heard lots of people say, oh, I don't really care what denomination a church is part of, as long as the pastor preaches the Bible. And like, no, that is not how traditional Christians thought. The traditional Christians didn't see the fundamental unit of the church as the congregation. I mean, Congregationalists did think that, but they still wanted the church to be as united as possible. Presbyterians see the unit of the church as the presbytery, and all presbyteries should try to be in some sort of communion with all other presbyteries. That's why we have synods, and that's why we have the General Assembly. So, traditional Protestantism, mainline Protestantism, doesn't see the church as just a fellowship of individual believers, and the church is purely just the set of everyone who believes in Jesus. Yes, that's the invisible church. We do have a doctrine of the invisible church. We also believe in the visible church. And the visible church is the institutional church. The visible church isn't just the set of all people who claim to be Christian. It isn't even just the set of all people who are baptized. The visible church is the institutional church. We make a distinction between visible church and invisible church, but they both exist. And that's why schism from the visible church is still wrong. Schism from the mainstream company of believers is still wrong, even if there is problems in that company of believers. So that's about it for this video, guys. The point here is that Protestantism is not actually that divided when you talk about mainline Protestantism. Yes, evangelical Protestantism is divided, and I fully admit that. But I think we just need to abandon evangelicalism. It was a failed project from the start. Protestantism has always been against evangelicalism, and the past 500 years have been a constant struggle between Protestants and these various evangelical groups that keep popping up and going away. Protestantism has continuity, where it's been basically the same institutions since the Reformation, and the Reformation took existing institutions and reformed them. So those institutions still existed before the Reformation. But evangelicalism has no continuity. It's just the same ideas that keep popping up and going away and then popping up again in some other form. So thank you for watching this video, and I will see you guys later.